My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a child psychologist who has spent the last 15 years working with traumatized children in rural communities across the American Southwest. In all my years of practice, I've encountered many challenging cases, but nothing prepared me for the extraordinary story I'm about to tell you. This is the account of how a mute man who had been silent for over a decade found his voice again through the desperate embrace of a lost Apache child. And how their unlikely bond changed both of their lives forever. The story begins in the small town of Cedar Ridge, Arizona, population 847, nestled in the high desert country near the Apache reservation. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, where the nearest hospital is 2 hours away, and where the landscape stretches endlessly under a sky so vast it makes you feel both insignificant and infinite at the same time. In this tight-knit community lived a man known simply as Silent Joe, though his real name was Joseph Whitehorse. A 45-year-old man of mixed Apache and Irish heritage who hadn't spoken a single word to another human being in 12 years, Joe lived alone in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, surrounded by 20 acres of scrubland that he had inherited from his grandfather. He made his living as a woodcarver, creating intricate sculptures and furniture that he sold through a local gallery. His work was extraordinary: detailed animals, traditional Apache designs, and abstract pieces that seemed to capture the very essence of the desert landscape. But Joe never spoke to his customers, never haggled over prices, never engaged in the small talk that was so much a part of life in Cedar Ridge. All business was conducted through written notes, nods, and gestures. The gallery owner, Maria Santos, had learned to interpret Joe's silent communications and served as an unofficial translator when necessary. "He's been like this since I've known him," Maria had told me when I first arrived in Cedar Ridge to establish a satellite clinic for the reservation children. "Nobody really knows what happened to make him stop talking, but everyone respects his silence. He's a good man, just broken somehow." The townspeople had grown accustomed to Joe's silence over the years. He would nod politely when he encountered neighbors, help with community projects when needed, and even attend town meetings, always sitting in the back, never contributing verbally, but clearly engaged and caring about his community. Children, however, seemed to sense something different about Joe. While adults had learned to accept his silence, children would often approach him with the fearless curiosity that only the young possess. They would show him their drawings, tell him about their pets, or simply sit near him during community gatherings. Joe would listen intently, sometimes smile, and occasionally ruffle a child's hair, but he never spoke. Dr. Robert Chen, the town's only physician, had known Joe since childhood and had tried numerous times over the years to understand the root of his silence. There was no physical trauma to his vocal cords, Dr. Chen had explained to me. No medical reason why he can't speak. It's psychological, clearly, but Joe has never been willing to discuss what caused it. He just stopped talking one day, and that was that. What I learned from the townspeople was that Joe's silence had begun 12 years earlier, shortly after he returned from serving 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan as a combat medic with the Army. He had come home to Cedar Ridge a changed man, withdrawn, haunted, and completely mute. He was always quiet, even as a kid, his neighbor, elderly Mrs. Patterson, had told me. But he used to talk, used to laugh. When he came back from the war, it was like someone had turned off a switch inside him. Joe's daily routine was predictable and solitary. He would wake before dawn, tend to his small garden, work on his wood carvings in his workshop, take long walks in the desert, and spend his evenings reading by lamplight. He had no television, no computer, no cell phone, just books, his tools, and the vast silence of the desert. The only sounds that came from Joe's property were the rhythmic tapping of his carving tools and the occasional call of a hawk or coyote. Neighbors had grown so accustomed to his silence that they used his property as a landmark for giving directions: turn left at Silent Joe's place. But Joe's carefully constructed world of silence was about to be shattered by an event that would change not only his life, but the life of a small Apache child who was about to become lost in the unforgiving desert landscape. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when 6-year-old Aiyana Begay wandered away from her grandmother's house on the reservation, about 15 miles from Cedar Ridge. Aiyana was a curious and adventurous child who had been visiting her grandmother, Aiyana Begay, for the week while her parents were attending a conference in Phoenix. Aiyana had been hanging laundry on the line behind her house when she realized that Aiyana was no longer playing in the yard where she had left her just minutes before. The child had simply vanished, as if the desert had swallowed her whole. "Aiyana?" Aiyana had called, her voice carrying across the empty landscape. "Aiyana, where are you?" But there was no response, only the whisper of wind through the sagebrush and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk. Aiyana immediately contacted the tribal police, who launched a search effort that quickly expanded to include local law enforcement, volunteer search and rescue teams, and eventually the FBI. The desert around the reservation was vast and dangerous, with temperatures that could kill a small child within hours and terrain that could hide a person forever. As the search entered its second day, hope was beginning to fade. Aiyana had been missing for over 36 hours, and the desert nights were getting cold. Search dogs had lost her scent at a creek bed about 5 miles from her grandmother's house, and helicopters had found no trace of the little girl. It was during this desperate search that Aiyana's path would cross with Joe Whitehorse's in a way that neither of them could have imagined. Joe had been aware of the search efforts, the sound of helicopters and the distant voices of search teams had penetrated even his isolated world. He had considered joining the search, as many townspeople had, but his inability to communicate effectively with the search coordinators had kept him away. Instead, Joe had been conducting his own quiet search, walking the desert paths he knew so well, looking for any sign of the missing child. He understood the desert better than most, knew its hiding places and its dangers, and felt compelled to help in the only way he could. On the morning of the third day, Joe was walking a narrow canyon about 10 miles from town when he heard something that stopped him in his tracks, the faint sound of crying. Following the sound, Joe discovered a small cave hidden behind a cluster of boulders. Inside, huddled against the back wall, was a tiny Apache girl with long black hair and tear-stained cheeks. She was wearing a pink t-shirt and jeans that were now dirty and torn, and she was shivering from cold and fear. Aiyana looked up when Joe's shadow fell across the cave entrance. And for a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silent man and the lost child. Joe slowly approached, moving carefully so as not to frighten her further. He could see that she was dehydrated and exhausted, but appeared to be uninjured. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a water bottle, offering it to her with gentle gestures. Aiyana hesitated for a moment, then reached for the water with trembling hands. As she drank, Joe noticed that she was watching him with intelligent dark eyes that seemed far too old for her 6 years. "Are you going to help me?" Aiyana whispered in a voice barely audible above the desert wind. Joe nodded, then gestured for her to come to him. But instead of simply following his lead, Aiyana did something that would change both of their lives forever. She threw her small arms around Joe's neck and held on with a desperation that spoke of 3 days of terror and loneliness. And then, as if sensing something in this quiet man that others had missed, she refused to let go. "Please don't leave me," she whispered against his shoulder. "Please don't leave me alone again." Joe felt something crack open inside his chest. A wall that had been built 12 years earlier, reinforced by silence and isolation, suddenly developing its first fissure. He wrapped his arms around the small child and held her close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest and her tears soaking through his shirt. For the first time in 12 years, Joe Whitehorse felt the overwhelming need to speak, to comfort this frightened child with words, not just actions. But the words remained locked inside him, trapped behind years of self-imposed silence. Instead, he did what he could. He picked up Aiyana and began the long walk back towards civilization, carrying her in his arms as she clung to him with a trust that was both heartbreaking and healing. As they walked through the desert, Aiyana began to talk, telling Joe about her grandmother, about how she had gotten lost chasing a butterfly, about how scared she had been in the cave. She talked as if Joe were responding, as if his silence was simply another form of conversation. "You're a good man," she said as they crested a hill that brought the town of Cedar Ridge into view. "I can tell. You have kind eyes, like my grandfather did before he went to the spirit world." Joe felt tears running down his cheeks, the first tears he had shed since returning from Afghanistan 12 years earlier. By the time they reached the edge of town, Joe could hear the voices of the search teams in the distance. Soon, Aiyana would be reunited with her family, and he would return to his silent life. But something fundamental had changed in those hours he had carried the lost child through the desert. Aiyana had awakened something in Joe that he thought had died in the mountains of Afghanistan, the ability to feel, to connect, to care about another human being's pain. And as the search team spotted them and began running in their direction, Aiyana looked up at Joe with those wise dark eyes and said something that would echo in his mind for days to come. "You saved me, but I think maybe I saved you too." Joe didn't respond, couldn't respond, but deep inside, he knew that the little Apache girl was right. In finding her, he had found something he thought he had lost forever, hope. The reunion between Aiyana and her family was emotional beyond description. Aiyana Begay collapsed to her knees when she saw her granddaughter safe in Joe's arms, tears streaming down her weathered face as she reached for the child she had feared was lost forever. "Aiyana, my little butterfly," Aiyana whispered in Apache, then in English, we thought we had lost you." The search teams, law enforcement officers, and volunteers who had been looking for Aiyana for 3 days gathered around as Joe gently placed the little girl in her grandmother's arms. There were tears, prayers of gratitude, and questions about where she had been found and how she had survived, but through it all, Joe remained silent, communicating only through nods and gestures when the sheriff asked him basic questions about the rescue. He had written a brief note explaining where he had found Aiyana, but beyond that, he offered no details about their time together in the desert. What struck everyone present, however, was Aiyana's reaction to being separated from Joe. Even as she clung to her grandmother, she kept reaching for him, her small hand grasping for his shirt, her eyes never leaving his face. "Don't go," she kept saying to Joe. "Please don't go away." Dr. Chen, who had arrived with the emergency medical team to check Aiyana's condition, noticed the unusual bond between the silent man and the rescued child. "She's in remarkably good condition," Dr. Chen told Aiyana after examining Aiyana. "Dehydrated and exhausted, but no serious injuries. She must have found shelter and stayed put, which probably saved her life." "The man who found her," Aiyana said, looking at Joe with gratitude and curiosity, "she won't let him leave. It's like she's afraid he'll disappear." Dr. Chen had known Joe for decades, but he had never seen him interact with anyone the way he was interacting with Aiyana. The usually withdrawn man was kneeling beside the child, allowing her to hold his hand while Dr. Chen completed his examination. "Joe," Dr. Chen said quietly, "I think she's going to need some time to process what happened to her. Would you be willing to stay with her until her parents arrive?" Joe nodded without hesitation, and for the next several hours, he remained by Aiyana's side as she was taken to the clinic for observation and as arrangements were made for her parents to drive up from Phoenix. During this time, something remarkable began to happen. Aiyana, still traumatized by her experience but feeling safe with Joe nearby, began to tell the story of her 3 days in the desert. But she told it as if Joe were participating in the conversation, pausing for his responses, nodding at his silent reactions, and treating his presence as a form of communication. "He found me in the cave," Aiyana told Dr. Chen, her small hand still gripping Joe's much larger one. "I was so scared, but when I saw him, I knew he was safe. He gave me water and carried me all the way here. He didn't talk, but I could tell he was taking care of me." Dr. Chen watched Joe's face as Aiyana spoke, noting the subtle changes in his expression, the softening around his eyes, the slight relaxation of his usually rigid posture, the way he seemed to be truly listening in a way that went beyond mere politeness. "Aiyana," Dr. Chen said gently, "can you tell me what you talked about with Joe while you were walking?" "I told him about my grandmother and my mom and dad," Aiyana replied. "I told him about school and my friends and my dog, Rusty. I told him about how my grandfather used to take me into the desert to show me the plants and animals." "And what did Joe tell you?" Aiyana looked at Joe with those wise dark eyes, then back at Dr. Chen. "He didn't use words, but he told me things. He told me he was sad about something, and that he's been alone for a long time. He told me he understands about being scared." Dr. Chen felt a chill run down his spine. This 6-year-old child seemed to have intuited things about Joe that the adults in his life had been trying to understand for 12 years. When Aiyana's parents, David and Maria Begay, arrived that evening, the reunion was joyful but bittersweet. Aiyana was overjoyed to see her parents, but she became distressed when she realized that Joe was preparing to leave. "No," she cried, clinging to Joe's arm. "He has to stay. He can't go back to being alone." David and Maria looked at Joe with gratitude and confusion. They had been told that a local man had found their daughter, but they hadn't expected this level of attachment. "Sir," David said to Joe, "we can never thank you enough for what you've done. You saved our daughter's life." Joe nodded and started to step back, but Aiyana's grip on his arm tightened. "Mom, Dad," Aiyana said urgently, "he doesn't talk, but he's not broken. He's just hurt inside, like I was hurt when I was lost. We need to help him." Maria knelt down beside her daughter. "Sweetheart, what do you mean?" "He carries sadness," Aiyana said with the startling clarity that sometimes comes from children. "Like when grandfather was sick and couldn't smile anymore. But when he helped me, I could see his smile trying to come back." That night, as Joe prepared to return to his cabin, Aiyana Begay approached him with a request that would begin to change everything. "Mr. Whitehorse," she said, using his full name with the respect due to someone who had saved her granddaughter's life, "Aiyana has been through a trauma. She's going to need time to heal from being lost and scared. Would you be willing to visit her sometimes? She seems to find comfort in your presence." Joe looked at Aiyana, then at Aiyana, who was watching him with hopeful eyes from her hospital bed. After a long moment, he nodded. "Thank you," Aiyana said. I think maybe you both need this." Over the following weeks, Joe began making regular visits to the Begay family. At first, these visits were brief and awkward. Joe would sit quietly while Aiyana played or drew pictures, his presence seeming to calm her anxiety about being alone, but gradually, something began to shift. Aiyana would talk to Joe as if he were responding, creating entire conversations where his silence became a form of participation. She would show him her drawings, tell him stories, and ask him questions that she would then answer herself, as if interpreting his thoughts. Joe thinks the butterfly in my picture needs more colors, she would tell her grandmother. He says butterflies are like people, they're more beautiful when they're not all the same. Aiyana began to notice that Joe's visits were having an effect on him as well. He seemed less rigid, more present, and there were moments when she caught him almost smiling at something Aiyana had said or done. One afternoon, about a month after the rescue, Aiyana was showing Joe a book about desert animals when she came to a page about wolves. My grandfather told me that wolves are like people, she said, looking at the picture. They need their pack to be happy. When a wolf is alone too long, it forgets how to be with others. She looked up at Joe with those penetrating dark eyes. I think you're like a wolf who forgot how to be with his pack. Joe felt something shift inside his chest, the same cracking sensation he had experienced when Aiyana first hugged him in the desert cave. But I think you're remembering, Aiyana continued. When you're with me, you don't look so alone. That evening, as Joe prepared to leave, Aiyana did something that surprised everyone. She walked up to him and took his hand, looking directly into his eyes. Joe, she said quietly, I know you can talk. I can see the words in your eyes. Someday, when you're ready, you'll remember how to let them out. Joe knelt down to her level, and for a moment, everyone in the room held their breath. His lips moved slightly, as if he were trying to form words, but no sound came. Aiyana smiled and hugged him. It's okay, she whispered. I'll wait. That night, Joe returned to his cabin with his mind churning. For 12 years, he had lived in silence, convinced that he had nothing worth saying, that his voice had been lost along with so much else in the mountains of Afghanistan, but this small Apache child had seen something in him that he had forgotten existed, the possibility of connection, of healing, of finding his way back to the world of the living. As he sat in his workshop, surrounded by his wood carvings, Joe picked up a piece of cedar and began to carve. But instead of his usual animals or abstract designs, he found himself carving the face of a small girl with wise dark eyes and a smile that seemed to hold the promise of hope. For the first time in 12 years, Joe Whitehorse fell asleep with the sound of a child's laughter echoing in his memory, and the faint possibility that maybe, just maybe, he might find his voice again. 2 months after Aiyana's rescue, the relationship between the silent man and the Apache child had become the talk of Cedar Ridge. People would see them together, Joe pushing Aiyana on the swing at the town park, the two of them sitting by the creek sharing a quiet lunch. Or walking the desert paths while Aiyana chattered and Joe listened with an attention that seemed to hang on every word. What amazed everyone was how natural their communication had become. Aiyana had developed an almost supernatural ability to interpret Joe's gestures, expressions, and body language. She would translate for him when necessary, but more often, she simply included him in conversations as if his silence was just another way of speaking. Joe thinks we should plant sunflowers in the school garden, she would tell her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez. He says they follow the sun, and that's what people should do too, always look for the light. Mrs. Rodriguez, like everyone else in town, had begun to wonder if Aiyana was somehow channeling Joe's actual thoughts or if she was projecting her own wisdom onto his silence. Either way, the insights she attributed to him were often profound and surprisingly accurate. Dr. Chen had been observing this unusual relationship with professional interest and personal concern. As Joe's longtime friend and physician, he could see changes in the man that went beyond his interaction with Aiyana. Joe seemed more present, more engaged with the world around him, and there were moments when Dr. Chen caught glimpses of the person Joe had been before the war. It's remarkable, Dr. Chen told me during one of our conversations about the case. I've been trying to reach Joe for 12 years, and this little girl has accomplished more in 2 months than all my efforts combined. But it was Aiyana Begay who provided the most insight into what was happening between Joe and her granddaughter. In our tradition, Aiyana explained to me, we believe that some people are born with the ability to see into others' hearts. Aiyana has always been special that way. Even as a baby, she could calm crying children just by being near them. She sees things that others miss. What do you think she sees in Joe? I asked. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the desert landscape that stretched endlessly beyond her porch. She sees a man who saved others until he couldn't save himself, Aiyana said finally. She sees someone who gave so much of his heart away that he forgot how to keep any for himself. But she also sees that the heart is still there, just waiting for someone to remind him how to use it. The breakthrough came on a cold December morning, 3 months after Aiyana's rescue. Joe had arrived for his usual visit to find Aiyana sitting quietly in her grandmother's living room, tears streaming down her small face. What's wrong, little butterfly? Aiyana asked, using her pet name for Aiyana. I had the dream again, Aiyana whispered. The one where I'm lost in the cave and no one comes to find me. Joe immediately knelt beside her chair, his face filled with concern. Aiyana looked at him with those wise dark eyes, now filled with the fear that still haunted her dreams. "In the dream, you don't come," she told Joe. "I call and call, but you can't hear me because you're lost too, somewhere far away where your voice can't reach anyone." Joe felt his chest tighten. He had been having his own nightmares, not about Afghanistan this time, but about failing to find Aiyana, about her dying alone in that cave while he remained trapped in his silence. "Joe," Aiyana said, reaching for his hands, "I'm scared that if you don't find your voice, you'll disappear like in my dream. I'm scared that the sadness will take you away from me." Something inside Joe broke open completely. 12 years of suppressed emotion, 12 years of buried trauma, 12 years of self-imposed isolation came crashing down like a dam bursting under too much pressure. He pulled Aiyana into his arms and held her close, feeling her small body shaking with sobs that matched the trembling in his own chest. "I won't disappear," Joe whispered, the words coming out rough and broken, barely audible. "I won't leave you." Aiyana pulled back to look at him, her eyes wide with amazement and joy. "You talked," she breathed. "You said words." Joe nodded, tears streaming down his face. I promised I wouldn't leave you. I had to say it out loud." Elena, who had been watching from across the room, felt her own tears begin to fall. She had witnessed something sacred, the moment when a broken man chose love over fear, connection over isolation. "Say something else," Aiyana urged, her small hands framing Joe's face. "Say my name." "Aiyana," Joe said, his voice stronger now. "My little butterfly." The floodgates had opened. Over the following hours, Joe began to speak, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. He told Aiyana about his nightmares. About the soldiers he couldn't save in Afghanistan, about the guilt that had stolen his voice and locked him away from the world. "I stopped talking because I was afraid," Joe explained, his voice still rough from disuse. "Afraid that if I spoke, I would have to feel everything I had been trying to forget." "But feeling things isn't bad," Aiyana said with the wisdom that continued to amaze the adults around her. "Grandmother says that feelings are like the desert rain, sometimes they hurt when they come, but they help things grow." Joe smiled. Really smiled, for the first time in 12 years. "Your grandmother is very wise." "So are you," Aiyana replied. "You just forgot for a while." Word of Joe's recovery spread quickly through Cedar Ridge. People who had known him only as the silent woodcarver were amazed to discover the articulate, thoughtful man who had been hidden beneath years of trauma-induced muteness. Dr. Chen was particularly moved when Joe came to see him a few days later. "I want to thank you," Joe said, his voice still carrying the hesitancy of someone relearning how to use it. "For never giving up on me, even when I had given up on myself." "It wasn't me who brought you back," Dr. Chen replied. "It was that little girl and your love for her." "She saved my life," Joe said simply. "Just like I saved hers in that cave. But her rescue was bigger than mine. She didn't just pull me out of the desert, she pulled me back into the world." Joe's transformation had a profound effect on the entire community. His story became a testament to the healing power of connection, the importance of never giving up on someone who seems lost, and the extraordinary wisdom that children sometimes possess. He began speaking at veteran support groups, sharing his story of trauma and recovery. His message was simple but powerful: healing is possible, even when it seems impossible, and sometimes it comes from the most unexpected sources. "I thought I had lost my voice forever," Joe would tell other veterans struggling with PTSD. "But I learned that silence isn't always protection, sometimes it's just another kind of prison. And sometimes, it takes the love of someone who believes in you to find the key." Joe and Aiyana's relationship continued to flourish. He became like a grandfather to her, teaching her about woodcarving, desert survival, and the importance of helping others who are lost or hurting. "Joe taught me that being strong doesn't mean you never get scared," Aiyana would tell people. "It means you help others even when you're scared yourself." A year after Aiyana's rescue, Joe established a program for at-risk children on the reservation, using art therapy and outdoor activities to help kids who had experienced trauma. Aiyana was his first volunteer, helping other children learn that healing is possible and that everyone deserves to have their voice heard. "We save each other," Joe would say when people asked him about his relationship with Aiyana. "That's what people do when they love each other, they take turns being strong." Aiyana Begay, watching her granddaughter and Joe work together with other children, often reflected on the mysterious ways that healing can occur. "The desert took my granddaughter for 3 days," she would say, "but it gave her back to us along with a man who had been lost much longer." Sometimes the spirits work in ways we don't expect. On the second anniversary of Aiyana's rescue, the town of Cedar Ridge held a celebration honoring both the little girl's courage and Joe's transformation. During the ceremony, Joe was asked to speak about his experience. 2 years ago," Joe said, his voice now strong and clear, "I was a man who had forgotten how to live. I existed in silence, convinced that I had nothing worth saying and no one worth saying it to. He looked at Aiyana, who was sitting in the front row with her family, beaming with pride. Then a little girl got lost in the desert, and in finding her, I found myself. She taught me that silence isn't always golden, sometimes it's just fear wearing a disguise. She taught me that healing doesn't always come from forgetting the past, but from finding someone worth building a future with. Joe paused, his eyes meeting Aiyana's across the crowd. She taught me that love is the most powerful voice of all, and that sometimes, when we save someone else, we save ourselves too. As the crowd applauded, Aiyana ran up to Joe and hugged him tightly, the same desperate embrace she had given him in that desert cave 2 years earlier, but now filled with joy instead of fear. I told you that you would remember how to let the words out, she whispered against his shoulder. You did, Joe replied, his voice filled with gratitude and love. You never stopped believing in me, even when I had stopped believing in myself. And in that moment, surrounded by a community that had witnessed their extraordinary journey from silence to voice, from isolation to connection, Joe Whitehorse knew that he had found something more valuable than words. He had found his way home. Warning. Legal notice: this story is completely fictional and was created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental.